In this video, we're going to see how to create a Terms and Conditions ClickWrap in Android. We're going to look at the technical details of creating one of these ClickWraps. A ClickWrap is when you enter an application and you have to hit I agree before you can use the application. So we are going to talk about a few legal terms in this video, and so I do want to start off by saying I'm not an attorney and none of this should be taken as any legal advice. Of course, on your application, probably the best thing to do is to consult with an attorney. But nonetheless, if you want the technical details of how to create a ClickWrap, this is the video for you. So a quick introduction, and then we'll jump right in and look at some code. So the steps. First thing is to create your terms and conditions. And there are a lot of good resources on the web that I found. There are several sites. This is one called termly.io that talks a little bit about what a terms and conditions is and gives you a template. Then there's this one, Terms Feed. This one's fairly handy because I noticed that it has examples of several terms and conditions from around the web, around the mobile app stores and things like that. So that one's Terms Feed. And then this one, also similar to Terms Feed, has a lot of really nice samples to get you started. This one is called freeprivacypolicy.com. So you can do a little bit of research there and you can come up with a fairly straightforward terms and conditions. I went ahead and created one that I'll show you. And I'll show it to you on the plantplaces.com website. Now on the web, it's fairly common to have privacy policy terms and conditions kind of down here towards the bottom. So I click on the privacy policy. This is one that dates back, one that I created a long time ago. And then I click on the terms and conditions. You see very straightforward black and white text, and references a lot of the guidelines that we see on these other pages. So in the web and in a read-only format, a lot of times having it down towards the bottom of a page is considered acceptable. Again, depending on your legal requirements. But if you have read-only, if you have like a read-only website, you might want to say some things about copyright and stuff like that. But there's less risk than if you are accepting data from the user and you're sharing that data, or you're accepting payment from the user and you're doing something with that payment, or you have an account and you want to be able to terminate that account if it's used incorrectly or essentially abusing your system. Also, you want to set out some terms about if a user contributes data to you, who owns that data, who has rights to that data. That's where a terms and conditions is really handy. So first thing, create the terms and conditions. Now, we saw that in the browser it's kind of subtle and towards the bottom, but I mentioned some cases where you want it to be a bit more prominent. Think about if you were to go to court, would somebody say, I never saw the terms and conditions? That's really the bar. Do you want to make it so that the user has to see it, or just so it's just kind of there? So ClickWrap means that the user has to click on agree. So for that, what we need in Android is a dialog fragment and an alert dialog. And that's what's going to actually show the terms and conditions. We only really need to show it once, or at least once for every revision. So we're going to have a very simple way of seeing if the user has accepted the terms and conditions already so that we don't have to show it again. And we're going to do that with some shared preferences. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Here's our demo application. It's a lot like the real Plant Places application that's out on the Play Store. It's not the real thing, but very similar nonetheless. At the moment, you can enter, and it comes right into this GPS a Plant screen without forcing you to acknowledge the terms and conditions. So let's make that acknowledgement happen. We're going to need a dialog fragment, and I can tell you from experience, the dialog fragment that's available in Android X, the newer support library, is a lot easier to use than the older ones. So if you have not done so already, go ahead and migrate to Android X. Now, it does have to change your project fairly significantly. It's a big process, so make sure you've done a commit, you've backed up all that stuff. I'll go ahead and choose migrate. Now I paused the video for a few moments so that I could go ahead and work through that upgrade and also validate that the application still works, and indeed it does. That's worthwhile. It's going to make our lives a lot easier. So at this point, what we want to do is we want to create the dialog fragment that's going to show our terms and conditions to the user. This is going to be an inner class that comes from that Android X library. So I scroll down towards the bottom of my class called gpsaplant.java, and that's the activity that the user is seeing the first time they enter the application. Down here, I'll declare the inner class public, class Terms and Conditions DialogFragment extends DialogFragment. The advantage of Android X is that we do not need to make this a static class. That makes this a lot easier to manage. Alt-Enter, and remember we want the Android X version of this, and there we go. Now in here we're going to override a method called onCreateDialog, just like so. And let's get rid of the super call. That's normally not something I would do, but it does make our life a bit easier in this case. Now, a dialog is something that has a lot of options, like a car. You can request a lot of options, and so it uses the builder design pattern to create a dialog. In other words, we don't just call a constructor. We don't require the dialog to create itself. Instead, we have something that's called a builder that's going to take all of our options as different method calls and then create the dialog that we want. So to make this happen, I'm going to say alert dialog.builder, and then we'll say builder equals new alert dialog.builder. And then we need to pass in a context. Let's go ahead and take care of our import. There we go. We'll get, let's see, we'll get it from, we'll do like so. Okay, we need a context which describes our application. If we're in an activity, we can usually just pass a reference to the activity in, but that will not work in this case because we're not in an activity. We're in the inner class of the activity. So we have to get a little tricky here. What we're going to say is we're going to reference the enclosing class, GPS, a plant, that's the activity, the class that we're inside, and then .this. And that's essentially borrowing the context from our enclosing class. Terminate with the semicolon. Now on the next line, we're going to set all the options that we want on this dialog. So I'm going to say builder, and then .set message. This, I'll tell you, is going to get a little bit tricky. I'm going to do this in a couple of different parts. So first of all, no semicolon to terminate this just yet, because remember, a builder is going to chain together a series of method calls where each method calls represents an option on what's being built. So we'll just leave that as is. And what I'm going to say in here is, by using this app, you agree to our, this is what the user will see obviously, terms and conditions and privacy policy. But it's not going to be a whole lot of use unless the user can actually see these terms and conditions and privacy policy. So let's put in a hyperlink here. I'm going to say ahref equals, and then we'll escape out double quote, and we'll say https www.plantplaces.com/tsandcs.shtml, and then we will close quote with the escape, and we'll put a close anchor tag on the other side of that terms and conditions. Similarly, for privacy policy, we will wrap this in an ahref equals, and then escape out the quote, https www.plantplaces.com/privacy.shtml. Again, close quote. Close the open part of the anchor tag, and then close the anchor tag. Now, one careful consideration here. Note that I'm linking out to a privacy policy in terms of use that's on a website. Think of the unfortunate scenario where you're in court and someone's claiming, I never saw this terms and conditions. Or someone might say, you changed these after the fact. So the advantage of hosting on a website is that you can change it, but the disadvantage is that you can change it. You might, depending on the nature of what you're doing, you might want to have a very, very thorough version history of when you updated your T's and C's. And if it's a significant update or a material update, you might want to have your users re-agree to it when you do that update. Again, consult an attorney. This isn't real legal advice, but just one thing to consider. On the other hand, you could bake the T's and C's into your application, which means, depending on the version that the user used, you know what they agreed to. But the downside is, anytime you need to make a change, if you made a misspelling, something like that, you have to re-release your application, which is just a matter of releasing it again, but that's a bit of work. So kind of a yin-yang to think about there. Nonetheless, I'm happy with this message I have to do a couple of more things. Note there's no semicolon here. I'm just going to hit enter. I'm chaining together these method calls, and I can now call set positive button, which means the user pressed the button agreeing. We could do set negative button, and that would allow us to put like a no, I don't agree. That might be interesting. You'd probably want to exit the app at that point. We're not going to worry about that. We're just going to force the user to say I agree, or the user's going to have to back out. You could also do a neutral button, so on and so forth. Moral of the story here is you only have to do set positive button if you want a positive button. If you don't want a positive button, don't call this option. If you don't want a negative button, don't call the negative button option. And that's the beauty of how builders work. Now, not only are we chaining methods together, but this is going to get a little trickier because set positive button accepts two parameters. One parameter is the text the user will see. I agree. The second parameter is an on-click listener, which you see here is an interface. And so we're going to create an anonymous inner class in line in this method call. Easy if you've done it before. If not, the syntax looks kind of goofy. So new dialog interface dot on-click listener. Nice thing is that Android Studio figures a lot of this out for us. So you see it's created the on-click listener, and it's created the method here that will be invoked when the user clicks. We're getting fairly far along here, so that's the last option I'm going to want to add. Now, I still need to add some behavior here in the on-click, but that's the last option I need to add to this builder. I can go ahead and terminate this chain of method calls with a semicolon. And now I can go into the on-click, and I can make note that the user agreed. Now, why do we need to make note that the user agreed? Once the user is agreed, we don't want to prompt them over and over again every time they open the app. So we want to record something in the app that says the user has already seen the terms and conditions, the user has agreed. I'm going to use shared preferences, which is just an easy way to kind of hold a couple things persistently within the application. That works for me. If you have highly sensitive information, you have financial data, things like that, you might want to actually store that the user did agree, the date the user agreed, and the terms, the version of the terms and service. You might want to make a service call here so that you can record that on your side, on the server side, and say, okay, this user agreed at this time. I'm not going to worry about that complexity. I'm just going to have the app know the user agreed and the app know not to prompt again. So for that, we're going to need some shared preferences. So I'm going to say get context, and then I'm going to say get shared preferences. Now here in the shared preferences, we need to provide it two things, and that is a unique name, kind of like a key value pair type thing. So I'm going to say plant places prefs, and then we need to give it a mode which says who's allowed to read and write here. We're going to make it mode private, which means only the application who wrote to this shared preferences can read from it. So context, and then mode private, just like so. And one more thing I'd like to do is make a constant out of this plant places prefs. I have a hunch we're going to need to use this again. So Control-Alt-C and plant places prefs. Let's go ahead and make it a constant in the enclosing class called GPSAplant. And there we go. Now that we have our shared preferences, we need to store a value in there to say that the user has agreed to our terms and conditions. So let's extract a local variable here, Control-Alt-V, and we'll go ahead and pick that first item. We'll call it prefs, just make life a little bit easier on us. And then new line, we're going to say prefs.edit, which gives us an editable way to talk to those shared preferences. Control-Alt-V again, store this into a local variable. We'll call that edit. And then here we'll say edit. Put Boolean. If you think about put extras with an intent, this is very similar. So we just need a key and a value. We'll say terms and conditions, and then true. True. Just like so. Terminate with a semicolon. You can probably guess what I'm going to do next. We're going to go ahead, take this terms and conditions, make it a constant, and put it in the enclosing class GPSAplant. Finally, edit.commit means thank you very much. We've done what we need to do. We're all set here. And then do a little tidying up. And finally, we have one more red line we need to take care of, and that is this onCreateDialog method returns an object of type dialog. So we need to say return builder.create. So that's part of the builder pattern. We've specified our options. We want to set message, we want to set positive button, and when we say create, it's actually going to create that dialog. So with that, we're now ready to go ahead and invoke this dialog from the onResume method. So we'll come up here, do Control F12, and we'll say onResume. There we go. Now, one note here. Think about the Android activity lifecycle. It starts with onCreate when the activity starts, then it goes to onStart, then onResume. OnResume, after that, it's in a state where we can use it. Now, because we want the user to accept terms and conditions before entering our app, we're putting this on the onResume, which means it's right before the screen renders and the user is able to interact with it. One footnote, I did notice one little snag. I'm not going to worry about in this video, but in a professional application, you might want to take care of this. Because we're linking to a website from this pop-up, it's possible that the user will leave our application and come back, and onResume will be called again, and this pop-up will appear again. I didn't worry too much about it. I figured, okay, fine, they can just click I agree twice. But you might want to do some kind of flag to say, have I already shown it? And a little more complication around there. That's just part of testing. Nonetheless, let's stick in this onResume method, and what I'm going to do is say Terms and Conditions DialogFragment. We'll just call this T's and C's equals new Terms and Conditions DialogFragment. So create an object of our class. Now we'll say T's and C's, and notice the bolded method here onCreateDialog. That is the one that we invoked. So it requires a bundle. I don't know that it's actually going to use this bundle for anything, but one trick that we can do, if I go up to my onCreate method, there we go. One trick that I did is I took the bundle that was passed into this activity and I simply saved it to a field so that I could use it later. We could pass that one in, we could create a new bundle. I haven't noticed it making a big difference either way, so I'll let you make a call on that one. But nonetheless, we'll say, okay, we'll say saved instance state, just like so, pass that in. Okay, and we want to save this in a variable, Control-Alt-V. We'll save it in a variable called dialog, and then we're going to say dialog.show, which will show this to the user. One more step, we need to make those hyperlinks actually clickable. And to do that requires kind of a funny little syntax here, so just bear with me. We'll say dialog, remember that's the dialog we're showing to the user, and then we'll say find view by ID, so we're looking for that view that has the text that the user will see. And then we'll say android.r.id.message, and that's just the magic component that represents the text the user sees. Now we need to invoke a method on here, but remember find view by ID just returns a view, so we need to do some casting. So we're going to cast this to a text view, just like so. And to make the casting the most effective, let's change the order of operations with parentheses. And then we're going to say set movement method. And then inside of this, we're going to say link movement method dot get instance. So a bit of typing, but that's just saying, hey, make those hyperlinks clickable. Now, there is one more thing I need to do to those hyperlinks to tell the dialog fragment that we want them to look like HTML. Because you see at the moment, I just have it as a quoted string, but we need to say, hey, when you render this, make it look like HTML. So we're going to use a library, HTML.fromHTML, and then we're going to wrap all of this in another set of parentheses. Just says, okay, interpret the tags as tags. Don't show them to the user like ahref, but actually make them look like tags. Alt-Enter, and there we go. Just a couple more things I want to tidy up, and then we're all good. First of all, I'm looking at what I did, and I'm second-guessing get context here. That normally works if we're in an activity, but now that I look at it, I realize we're within an inner class, and I need to be a little bit more explicit. So I'm going to say GPS a plant.this.get shared preferences. That way I'm explicitly reaching out to the enclosing class, and I am getting the shared preferences from there. This will be a little bit safer. Just a note, one other thing I recommend here is you notice I put in straight text in the for the I agree. We typically like to put that in strings XML. I noticed when I did this earlier, a couple days ago in another application, that it had a lot of trouble with strings.xml because it's in this inner class, unless I referenced it with gapasapplant.this.getString. I had to actually call a reference out to the enclosing class. So just a note, if you're using string resources, you might need to do a little trickiness like I did here. But there again, that just reminded me that I needed to make this change here. One more change we need to make. So I'm going to go to on resume. And you notice I'm putting up the T's and C's right now, but as it is, I'm putting up the T's and C's every time on resume is called, and that's going to be called quite a bit. Okay, but then you remember that we did all this work to save that the user had agreed to T's and C's down here in our dialog fragment. So let's make some use of that. Quick Control F12 takes me back to the onResume method. And what I'll do first is I'll just get a reference to the shared preferences. So we'll say get shared preferences. And remember, we need a key. Plant places prefs. Remember that constant we made down in our dialog fragment inner class down below? So this is linking these two shared preferences together. What we wrote in the dialog fragment, we're going to read here. So plant places prefs. And then once again, we have our context dot mode private, just like we did before. That's fine. This is both the same application, so that'll work just fine. Okay. Now we'll do the Control-Alt-V trick. Save this into shared preferences, just like so. And now what we need to do is we need to get the value that we stored earlier, if we stored a value earlier. So let's say shared preferences dot get boolean. Now remember, once again, we stored the boolean with a key value pair. Just quick memory on that. So you notice the constant that we used in our terms and conditions fragment for the shared preferences is plant places prefs, and then the boolean that we're saving is terms and conditions. So just a little jog the memory there. Back to onResume. So for the get boolean, we're going to use that same constant, terms and conditions, just like so. Now this takes two arguments. It takes the key, and then it also takes a default value if it cannot find anything associated with that key in our shared preferences. This is important because keep in mind, the very first time we've come here, the user has not even seen the terms and conditions and hasn't seen that dialog box. So nothing is associated with terms and conditions. So if that's the case, let's assume false because the user has not yet agreed. So this can return. It will return true if the user's already agreed. It will return false if this is the user's first time in the application. So this is easy to wrap within an if test because we only want to show this dialog if the user has not agreed to it already. The only trick is our if test is a bit backwards right now. We're saying we're basically saying if the user has seen the terms and conditions before, then show it. We want to say if the user has not seen the terms and conditions before, then we want to show it. So this is going to return true if the user has seen it, false if the user has not. Because an if test will evaluate only if the condition is true, we just need to turn those upside down, make a true a false, make a false a true, and we can do that with the negation operator. So I think we're in good shape now. We're checking to see if the user's seen it. If not, we're showing it. If the user has seen it, we don't show it. User's already seen it, we're good. And then down at the bottom, I think we're looking in pretty good shape here as well. At this point, I'm fairly comfortable that we should be in good shape. So I'm going to go ahead and debug and put this on the emulator. And you see now, sure enough, the dialog has come up and it says, by reusing this app, you agree to our terms and conditions and our privacy policy. So I click on the T's and C's. And you see it's taking me out to a web view here and it's showing me those T's and C's. I go back to our app, I choose I agree, and guess what? It lets me in the app. But now here's the real tell. Let's go ahead and let's close the app and let's reopen the app and see if it prompts us again for T's and C's. So go back to our home screen And we'll open the app again. Now, I will tell you, when the app opens normally, it downloads some plant names and it shows a dialog box. So you may see a dialog box just briefly, but it's not the terms and conditions, and it will automatically disappear. So let's go ahead, double click. There's our downloading plant names. Notice it went away. Notice I was not prompted for terms and conditions the second time I opened. So this has been a look at how to create a terms and conditions ClickWrap in Android. In this, we looked at shared preferences and dialog fragments and several other things. I hope this video has been helpful, and I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you.